Hi everyone, this is Marc Sabatella, MuseScore Director of Education, and I'm here to talk to you. We'll be looking at MuseScore, but I really just want to talk about music today. If people have MuseScore questions, I'm happy to answer them. But some of the things that I have on my mind to talk about is just kind of the process of writing music. And some of the things that I run up against when I'm writing and when I'm teaching music, the things that I see my students running up against, just some things that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So people who have been around for MuseScore for a while may remember me specifically because of the demo piece for MuseScore that was in version 1.2 or 1.3. I've actually forgotten when it was introduced. And I figure I'll just play this for people who haven't heard it, or just to remind you of what it sounds like. So that's the piece that I wrote specifically to be the demo piece for MuseScore. The challenge was that it was supposed to demonstrate all these different features of MuseScore, from time signature changes, key signature changes, triplets, and just everything you could imagine. This cross-staff notation here. I was just trying to show off all the different things MuseScore could do, and then try to make it sound like music. So that's a piece that I wrote one day to try to do that when I was asked to compose a demo song. So some of the things that I think about when I'm writing music, I mean, really the first thing I'm thinking about is the melody that I'm composing around. And I figure everyone has their own ways of writing melodies and thinking of melodies, and that in some ways that's the hardest thing to actually talk about because it's such a personal thing. But there's so many other aspects of composing that we can really talk about from the perspective of kind of the craft of it. And by the way, I'm not just talking about composing. The same things apply to arranging existing music. It applies to transcribing pieces that you're hearing and trying to get them accurate and readable. So some of these things are just general concepts of writing music, whether it's composing it or some other form. One of the things that I guess is always really important to me is voice leading. Voice leading is a term that you hear about in a music theory class, which of course well, not of course, but I've taught music theory for many years. And voice leading is taught in this context of, oh, it's this thing that you do when writing a 4-part chorale in the style of Bach, and you learn all these rules, and then you sort of forget that these rules actually apply to all sorts of other things. And what voice leading really is about is connecting things smoothly in ways that make sense. If you look at the melody of this piece, the melody is, well, I'll start at the beginning. Right, so that's the melody, but then there's this second part here. So this part here is also trying to sound smooth. It's not the melody. If you are thinking of this as a 4-part arrangement, that would be the alto part. And I'm trying to make that also be smooth, both to make it easier to play physically on the piano. It would be easier to sing if you're a singer, and it's would be it also just sounds better that way. So this is, let me just check this and make sure it's nothing important. Okay, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. The idea with voice leading is to create a line that sounds and looks smooth, that makes it easier to play and it makes it sound better. So I want to talk about this in a very specific context of something I see all the time. So people might want to write something that's a C chord, and then they want to write a G chord, and then they want to write a C chord. So if you just play this, then to play that on the piano, your hand has to physically jump from the first chord and then pick it up and play the next one, and then pick it up again to play the next one. And it's not impossible to play. I mean, certainly whole notes are easy to play, but if I change that into something like more rhythmically interesting, say something that was some eighth notes, say. Say that was the pattern, and then I wanted to do the same pattern here. So this pattern here then, by having the exact same pattern in both measures, I mean, it's nice, it gives the piece some unity, but we could do better voice leading wise if we really thought about how this pattern really might want to go. So instead of putting the G chord this way, I want to voice lead it a bit better by putting keeping the common tone G on top. So instead of having G, B, D, I'm going to go B, D, G. And now you can see the top line is G, G, G. The middle line is E, D, E. The bottom line is C, B, C. You can tell I'm not a professional singer, but I know how to pick out the lines that I want to sing. So this, where'd my cursor go? Oops. And then I could apply the same thing to how I've written this line. Instead of writing it starting on the G, I could start on the B. Oops, I meant. So this is taking that same pattern and now it's playable in the same way that this passage with the whole notes is playable in one hand on the piano. This passage, I mean, playable in one hand without having to pick it up and move it. You can just leave your thumb on the G and the other two fingers go down. The same is true of this pattern. When you play this on the piano, your hand doesn't have to move and it just sounds smoother. And this doesn't just apply then to the piano. If I was arranging this for, say, 3 trombones, the top trombone would be going ba-da-dum, and the middle one would be going ba-da-dum, the bottom one would be going ba-da-dum. So it would be 3 smooth lines, and it would be easier for them to play. There wouldn't be all this. Actually, there might be. A trombone's kind of an oddly designed instrument. But it would sound smoother and usually would be easier to play if the lines are smoother. So this sort of thing, this voice leading, connecting chords like that, is just, I don't know, it's something that you really always want to be thinking about when you're writing music, whether it's for instruments or to be sung, whether it's arranging for multiple instruments, playing on the piano, or singing. It just really makes things smoother, easier to play, easier to sing, and just sound better. So that's just like something that use of inversions like this to create this smooth voice leading, and then realizing that applies even when the notes are broken up like this. It's still the case that we've got the G as our top note, we've got the C going down to the B, and then going back up to the C if I copied and pasted this measure over here. And then the middle line is the E, and then D, and then back up to the E, so that this line, this voice leading, applies even though the line is broken up like that. The same voice leading applies. I know, so that's something that I see a lot of people when writing music. They're putting in these chords, but they're not thinking about the voice leading, and the music isn't as effective as it otherwise would be. Now, there's certainly times, because there is something useful and valuable about the idea of what's called root position, having the root of the chord on the bottom. And sometimes that is worth doing, but you can do that sometimes without sacrificing voice leading by having, the upper notes. So like I could just add another G to this chord on the bottom. Oops. There we go. So at this point now, the top line is still G, 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 the middle line, the second line is still E, D, E, and then this line is C, B, C for the tenor, but then maybe the bass part, maybe this C is doubled, or maybe there's just another C. So that it's, I can almost get that. G. Yeah, I kind of got it. It's early in the morning for me, so I can still kind of squeak out a low C. There you go. So this now allows the bass voice to jump around and do the roots if that's what you really need, while the other voices are smooth. And you'll see I'm using that sort of idea in Reunion. I mean, if you look at the chords here, you'll see that this is an F chord here. If you add it all up, this is an E flat chord, more or less. It's actually something different, but this is a B flat chord. But I put the D on the bottom so that this gives me a smooth line. This is a B flat minor chord with a D flat on the bottom. This is an F chord with the F on the bottom. And I'm doing this for voice leading reasons. But once I got to this chord is meant to be an A minor chord. And I really, even though I could have kept the C on the bottom, I really wanted the sound of the bass note having the root here, and then the root here for this D chord with some alterations, so that the bass voice often follows the roots of the chords, even when it would be possible for it to be smoother. That's just the way music is usually constructed. The bass favors the roots, but and you can see that happening here. In measure 5, I lost my cursor again, but measure 5 here, A is the root of this chord, and then D, and then G, and then C. The chords tend to follow the circle of fifths in many pieces, including this one, and that means that the bass is going to be jumping around by either a fourth up or a fifth down a lot. And that's okay. You give it smooth voice leading where you can. Like here, I'm going C, and then B flat, and then A. So that was able to be smooth. And this, F, E flat, D, D flat, C. So I was able to make that be smooth, and I wanted it to be smooth. Other places, I just want the bass to be the root. So I guess that's one of the things that if you're arranging or composing music and you're kind of just getting started at this, or if maybe you've done some exercises in voice leading before but never really thought about how it applies to other situations, these are some things you could think about. One of the other things that I notice in this is there's a lot of accidentals in this music. And often when I see people writing some of their first music, it's diatonic, meaning there's no accidentals in it. And not that accidentals are inherently a good thing, but I think often people don't know how to use them or when to use them or really what their purpose is. And so I feel like I want to say a couple things about that that would maybe help some people create more interesting music. At this point, we get a little more into theory, which I guess is part of what I'm talking about, a big part of what I'm talking about. The I guess main thing that I would want to say about accidentals is they should usually serve a purpose, or do usually serve a purpose in most what we call tonal music, which includes pretty much classical music up through 1900, and most folk and pop and rock and a good chunk of jazz is really, it has a key center, it has chords that reinforce that key center, and the accidentals are part of this. So one of the things that I want to look at then is this chord right here. If you see, I'm going to ignore those two notes for a moment. The F sharp here is not in the key, obviously. This song is in the key of F, and I needed an accidental to make this F sharp. And the idea is this is a D chord leading to a G chord, a G minor chord. And I want that D chord going to the G chord to feel like a stronger motion. And one of the things, it's going down a fifth, and if we know, the circle of fifths tells us that chords like to go down a fifth, but if we make this a major chord instead of the diatonic chord, this a D chord in the key of F would have been a D minor chord. If I had made that an F natural, then this would be a D minor chord. By making it an F sharp, it strengthens this motion. So I'm going to just play this measure the way it is. So I'm going to do it now without those two notes. I'm just going to delete those two notes for a second, because that is a different thing. So now I'm going to do it and make the F sharp into an F natural. So I could slow it down a little bit also. I think I might do that. Oops, I forgot. I forget the shortcut for the play panel because I use it so seldom, actually. But it's F11 for those of you keeping score. So that F natural there versus, well, let me go on. And now I'll make it an F sharp again. So it's uses of accidentals to create major chords that would otherwise be minor when they're wanting to go down a fifth like that is like a really important concept in music theory. It's called a secondary dominant. Of all the things that you would ever learn in a music theory course, these two things that I've actually just talked about, voice leading and secondary dominance, boy, if you can really, really get those two things, not that I think I've just told you everything you need to know there, but secondary dominance and voice leading are just huge, huge, huge parts of the music creation process. And of course, I'm showing it in the context of like a classical-ish piece, but the same things apply if you're writing a pop song, the same things apply if you're writing jazz or really most other styles of music. That good voice leading goes a long ways to making it more playable and sound better, and use of these accidentals, non-diatonic notes to create secondary dominance. I mean, that's huge, a huge part. In fact, if we looked at like all the songs that anyone might learn on guitar, to campfire songs and basic folk songs, they're mostly whatever key you're in, the chords in that song will mostly be in that key, except for a few secondary dominants. This is like the one most important type of chord that's not in the key to really get a sense of, is how to use these secondary dominants. So anyhow, those are just two important like theoretical concepts to know about. Since I did go about adding these two extra notes, I should just talk about these. These accidentals are about harmonic color, and now we're definitely in a very jazz-specific language here. This E flat is the ninth of the chord, but it's flatted. That's the fifth of the chord, but flatted. These are sounds we use a lot in jazz, flatted ninths, flatted fifths, and other things, and there's very kind of specific ways we go about using those, but those notes sound really good in this case when you have these secondary dominants. And this also, let me just talk about the voice leading. Here's another case where it's kind of a broken voice leading, but it's still important. If you follow this F sharp, it connects to this G. Really maybe to the A, I would say. Bum, ba, da, da, dum is the line. And then that's kind of this middle line here. The bottom line is bum, bum, boom, bum, bum. That's that bottom line. You know, and this line, bum. This line is bum, and then it doesn't come into here again. Ba-dum. So, you know, you can be thinking about voice leading. It's not necessarily adjacent notes, because when the chords are broken up like this, sometimes it's notes that aren't adjacent, but they're still connecting in some way. Anyhow, that's a whole bunch of theory for you, some music theory. Just to talk about something that's less theoretical, but more, I don't know, big picture of composing music. I want to show you what some of my pieces look like when I first write them, because I usually don't write directly into MuseScore for a couple of reasons. One is MuseScore isn't really designed for that kind of like working out of ideas and changing things as drastically as they change when initially writing. And I think maybe that's a mistake people make also, is trying to put their ideas directly into a notation program. Even if the program was designed to support that better, the mere fact that you've gone to the trouble of putting it in the notation program and then play it back and hear it that way, it makes it, I don't know, psychologically harder to then want to change that. And usually I find I like to keep ideas more flexible for longer before I really set them down. So here is a typical piece of mine as it starts. I think I'm holding it up to the camera. It's chicken scratch is the technical term for that. Here's another one. So like this piece is an especially good example. Well, both of them were. You can see I'm just putting down note heads because I haven't really totally thought through the rhythms of these pieces yet. Some other pieces, I do know the rhythms pretty much right away. In fact, this section here is a very specific rhythm. So sometimes when the piece starts out in my head, it has a specific rhythm. Sometimes it doesn't, and I will just jot down what I need to. And what I'm doing is getting the ideas down on paper as fast as I'm thinking of them, without having to worry about all these details of how to notate it perfectly. I want to get the idea down. I'm either sitting at the piano, sometimes I'm just sitting down at a coffee shop. In one case, I remember I was at a Chinese restaurant when I wrote my first kind of large-scale orchestra piece. I wrote a lot of it on a on a scrap of paper and literally a napkin at a Chinese restaurant. And I was just hearing ideas in my head and jotting them down as closely as I could. Then I went home to the piano and kind of checked out, well, was that really the notes that I wanted, and fixed some things up. But often it doesn't matter, you know, I wanted to get the shape of the idea down. And sometimes I'll have like this piece of paper here that's got an idea here and an idea here. And I think you can see maybe I've got arrows here. Often what happens is I'll write down an idea and I'll say, okay, and then it goes here. And then as I sing it back or play it back, I think, oh, wait a minute, instead of going here, maybe there's this other way it could resolve. It's kind of like if you're writing a story and you're not sure, boy, after, you know, so-and-so goes to the store, do they buy eggs and come home, or do they run into their old friend and, you know, hang out in the car drinking a six-pack? That's Dan Fogelberg's song. That's okay. When you're writing a story, it kind of is expected to be linear, and so it is with music, but you're allowed to, in fact, with music, it's good to reuse ideas. So I've got this melodic idea here, and maybe it goes this way the first time, but then later on I might reuse that idea, but it might resolve this way the next time. And it could literally be putting a repeat around it and have this be the first ending and this is the second ending. But maybe this happens, like this piece was it's about a 10-minute piece for orchestra, and I think These two sections, when it goes this way versus when it went that way, are I think like about 3 or 4 minutes apart, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that happens, and this line, when it comes back, it just goes to a different place. So it's not just a repeated section, but it's like all this other stuff that happens. And then there's this other snippet of idea that I wrote down, and I didn't even realize it was related, but then later on, I mean, even without looking at the notes, you can see ba-da-dum, and then down here you can see ba-da-dum. Sometimes I'm writing ideas and I think that they're just different ideas, and then later on I see something that's connected about them. I mean, that was pretty obviously connected when I pointed at them, but they're not. It wasn't that obvious when I first wrote the idea because it was a very different context for them. And that's sometimes interesting. Because the first idea was in my head, it made sense that the second idea might come out and sound similar, and I might not realize it right away and might not realize how I'm going to make use of that information, and that's okay. So by putting this down just on a scrap of paper and then sorting out how I'm going to use those ideas, how I'm going to connect them. Oh wow, this idea here is connected to that idea there. Maybe if I move them adjacent, we'll notice that connection. Or maybe I'll find a way of developing some new material that connects them. This is the sort of thing that I'm doing all the time when I'm composing, at least if I'm composing a piece of any length. If I know I'm just composing a 32-bar jazz tune or something, even then I'm often thinking that way. But especially if I'm composing a larger piece. So anyhow, those are just some thoughts about music. I mentioned that I love to answer people's questions. I recognize this isn't necessarily the best time for people to be watching this live, and so I don't always get questions while I'm talking, and that's fine. But please, if you've got anything at all you would want to say or ask, I'm checking out the chat, and if I see anything that I would I would want to respond to anything. So that's those are some of the things that I was intending to talk about, and there's lots of other details. There's so many details to know about when writing music, or to think about when writing music. And that's really just a sampling of some of the things that I think about. I guess the last thing maybe that I would talk about, thanks, some nice comment there. Counterpoint is just another topic that I love, and I would just like to mention that for a moment. Counterpoint is the idea of having different parts that have their own independent melodies that are really like strong, powerful melodies in themselves. Like this, there's counterpoint here in that top line was ba da 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 da, but this line is ba da 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 da. So I can already tell I've drifted in pitch because that I'm nowhere near a C. Is there. So I've drifted because I'm not a good singer, but I still was able to sing you more or less what the line is. That is a form of counterpoint, but when you take that to the next level of really writing independent lines, and that's an interesting thing also, when they're really just lines that are just worth hearing on their own. And in the Renaissance and in the Baroque era, the main form of counterpoint that we really encountered was imitative counterpoint, where you have a melody line that then is repeated literally in another voice, either at the same pitch or maybe a fifth higher or a third higher or something like that. And then when you use that and then put that, well, anyhow, I'll demonstrate that. Here's a melody. So that's a bit of a melody that I composed, and now there's a little connection. That melody that just came in is the same melody as the beginning one. And then it comes in here, fifth higher. boo bum ba doo da da boo. It comes in a fifth higher with some adjustments made to make it fit the key. And meanwhile, the original voice keeps doing something different. Use of counterpoint like that, imitative counterpoint specifically in this example, where you have melodies that are stated by one instrument and then another instrument that has a really strong melody, but maybe the first instrument keeps doing something else. That's a really powerful composing technique that, again, is most associated with Baroque and Renaissance classical music, but it can also be used in jazz and can be used in rock and pop and anything you want it to be used in, really. Anyhow, these are that's probably an underused technique by people who haven't specifically studied it, and it's one of those things that when you do specifically study it, a lot of people, including me, kind of fall in love with it and then probably go overboard using it more than we maybe should. Anyhow, so those are some musical thoughts of mine, and hope that people found this useful or interesting. Anyhow, so signing off for today, and I will catch you next week. Thanks.